The moment she said it, I felt my throat close like I'd swallowed a small stone. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Just that quiet, sharp pressure you get when someone names the thing you've been pretending isn't there. We were standing beside a row of canned soup in a grocery store that smelled faintly of coffee from the little kiosk near the entrance, and Margaret, 58, steady hands, eyes that didn't waste time, tilted her head and said, "We're too old to fall in love." And I, Thomas, 59, did the one thing I've always been good at doing when feelings get too close. I stayed quiet. I live in a small town in Pennsylvania where people wave from their porches and the same 3 pickup trucks seem to pass you every day. My life, for a long time, has been built out of routine. Morning coffee. A short walk if the weather behaves. A part-time shift at the hardware store to keep my hands busy and my mind from circling old memories. I'm not a sad man, not exactly. I'm a careful man. After my divorce, I learned that hope can be expensive, and I got used to paying in smaller coins, reliability, solitude, and the calm of not expecting anything big. Margaret came into my days the way most real things do, without music, without a spotlight. I'd seen her before, of course. Same checkout lane, same church fundraiser posters, same library book sale. She had that look some people carry in their posture, like they've had to be their own backup plan for a long time. The first real conversation happened because the clerk couldn't get the coupon app to load and Margaret, calm as a nurse, offered her phone. I made a joke about how I missed the days when a coupon was just a square of paper you clipped with your own hands. She smiled, small and quick, and said paper was honest. That was it. Not a flirt. Not a line. Just a sentence that told me she paid attention. Over the next couple of weeks, we kept running into each other. Not in a movie way, more like the town itself nudged us into the same corners. A morning at the diner where the waitress calls everyone Han, whether you deserve it or not. A rainy afternoon at the post office when the line moved slow and someone complained about stamps getting more expensive. Margaret would nod politely, say 1 or 2 dry sentences, and I'd feel that strange relief of being around someone who didn't perform for the room. If you're my age, you know the difference between noticing and chasing. Chasing belongs to younger men who think time is endless. Noticing is what happens when you've lived long enough to respect the weight of a single moment. I noticed the way Margaret listened with her whole face. I noticed how she never complained, but she also never pretended. I noticed that when she laughed, it came out like she'd surprised herself. That day, in the grocery store, I'd come in for a short list, milk, bread, the kind of boring things that make a life run smoothly. Margaret was comparing labels on tea, reading them like they were contracts. I said, "You look like you're negotiating with that box." She smiled and said, "I am. Everything costs something." Then she surprised me by asking, "Do you ever think about what you missed?" It wasn't a flirt. It was a real question. And because it was real, it hit me harder than any compliment ever could. I should tell you something about me. I'm good at steering away from questions like that. I can change the subject so smoothly people think it was their idea. I can joke. I can talk about sports and the price of lumber. I've spent years polishing that skill until it looked like personality. But standing there with fluorescent lights above us and the low hum of refrigerators around us, I felt tired of the detour. So I said, sometimes. One word. Honest, but small enough to stay safe. Margaret nodded like she understood exactly how much it cost me to say it. Then she said, gentle and certain, "At our age, people don't fall in love. Not the way they used to." She didn't sound bitter. She sounded practical, like she was explaining gravity. Like she'd already made peace with it and was inviting me to do the same. And that's where my first real choice showed up, right there between the cereal and the soup. I could have pushed back. I could have said something noble, something about how love doesn't have an expiration date, how it's never too late, how I'd seen it happen. I could have asked her out for coffee and turned her statement into a challenge. But I didn't, because challenging her would have meant admitting I wanted the argument. It would have meant admitting I wanted more than polite conversation and shared weather reports. It would have meant stepping out of the safe life I'd built and letting someone see that I still cared. Silence felt safer. Silence let me keep my dignity, intact. Silence let me pretend I was just being respectful, letting her finish her thought. So I stood there and said nothing. I watched her eyes search mine for a second, not pleading, not hopeful, just checking what kind of man I was. Then she looked back down at the tea like it mattered. We walked to the checkout together because our carts happened to line up that way. The clerk asked if we'd found everything, and Margaret said, yes, even though I could tell she hadn't. I paid for my milk and bread, and she paid for her tea and a single frozen meal, the kind that comes with instructions printed in a cheerful font. In the parking lot, the air was cold enough to make your lungs feel clean. She said, take care, Thomas. And for a second, I wondered how long she'd known my name. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, don't let your life get too quiet. I drove home with the heater on and my hands tight on the wheel. I kept replaying the moment, like I could edit it into something better. I told myself I'd done the mature thing. I told myself I'd protected both of us from awkwardness. But when I walked into my quiet house and set the grocery bags on the counter, I realized the truth. My silence hadn't protected her. It had protected me. I sat at the kitchen table, coat still on, and realized I wanted to hear her voice again, if only once. I stood there staring at the bread like it had answers, and I heard her sentence again, we're too old, and something shifted. Not romance, not a fantasy, just a clear, uncomfortable thought. If love doesn't show up in a life like mine, it might be because I keep the door locked. That thought scared me too. I first saw her again through the windshield, standing in the drizzle like she hadn't noticed it had started to rain. My wipers dragged back and forth, slow and tired, and there was Margaret, holding the door of the post office for an older man with a cane, her coat already darkened at the shoulders. It wasn't a thought that brought me to a stop. It was my foot, easing off the gas before my mind had agreed. I parked without telling myself why. Sometimes the body decides before pride gets involved. If you're watching this and you're around my age, you know that feeling, the quiet moment when routine cracks, just a little, and something unexpected slips in. I waited a second too long before getting out of the car, long enough to feel foolish. She didn't see me at first. She was focused on the man, making sure he was steady on the curb. When she turned, her expression changed, not surprise exactly, but recognition, like she'd filed me somewhere important without making a show of it. Looks like we keep running into each other, she said. No edge. No apology. Just a fact. We stood there under the awning while the rain tapped against the metal like loose change. The town felt smaller in that moment, and not in a bad way. I told her I'd come to mail a bill. She said she was waiting on a letter she didn't expect to arrive on time anyway. That sentence stayed with me. People who've been disappointed enough learn to soften their expectations without announcing it. We walked inside together, the smell of damp coats and paper filling the space. The line was short, too short, short enough that there was no natural excuse to keep talking. And that's where my second real choice showed up. I could keep it polite. I could wish her well and step aside. Or I could let the conversation exist a few seconds longer than it needed to. I asked her about the tea. It was a small question, almost nothing. But she smiled, and for the first time since I'd known her, she talked about herself without deflection. She told me she read labels because her late husband used to ignore them, and she'd learned the hard way that details matter. She said his name once, casually, without ceremony. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer sympathy like a transaction. I just listened. You'd be surprised how rare that still is. When we stepped back outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. She adjusted her coat and said, I shouldn't keep you. There it was again, that assumption that her presence was a burden. I felt something tighten in my chest, not romantic, not dramatic. Protective, maybe. Or respectful. I've got time, I said. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement. We walked down the block together. She told me she'd worked in an administrative office most of her life. The kind of job where you're invisible unless something goes wrong. She liked it that way. I told her about the hardware store, about how younger guys ask me questions even though they could look it up on their phones. They don't want answers, she said. They want permission. I laughed harder than I expected. There was an ease between us that didn't feel borrowed. Still, in the back of my mind, her words from the grocery store waited, patient and heavy. Too old. Not like before. I wondered if she said it to protect herself or to warn me. Or both. We stopped at the corner where our paths split. She thanked me for the company, and I almost let it end there. Almost. But then I saw it, the way she paused, like she might say something else if I gave her the space. My heart picked up, not from desire, but from risk. Saying nothing would be easy again. Silence had already proven its usefulness. Speaking meant changing the shape of things. Would you want to sit for a cup of coffee sometime? I asked. The words felt heavier than they should have. She didn't answer right away. She looked at me carefully. The way you look at a door you're not sure you want to open. I don't want misunderstandings, she said. Neither do I replied. That was the truth. Not reassurance. Not pursuit. Just a line I could stand behind. She nodded once. All right, she said. Coffee. Then she smiled, softer than before, and walked away before I could say anything foolish. I stood there longer than necessary. The street quiet again, feeling a shift I couldn't name yet. It wasn't joy. It wasn't fear. It was the uneasy knowledge that by asking, I'd stepped out of a life I understood, and there was no guarantee I'd know how to step back. The first sign of trouble wasn't a person. It was a laugh, two women laughing too loudly near the paint aisle, followed by my name said like it belonged to a story. Thomas, one of them giggled. Is that you? I didn't look up right away. At 59, you learn that some attention is harmless and some attention is a hook. I kept shaking the can of primer in my hand, listening to the little metal ball rattle, buying myself a second to decide what kind of man I was going to be. They were regulars at the hardware store, the kind who come in for one screw and leave with a conversation. Patty and Elaine. Friendly enough, but friendly in a way that travels. Morning, I said, finally turning. Patty's eyes flicked to my left hand, as if she expected to find a ring. Elaine smiled like she already knew the answer to a question I hadn't heard yet. We saw you walking with Margaret, Patty said, like she was commenting on the weather. After the post office. I felt heat rise in my neck. Not because I'd done anything wrong. Because I hadn't decided if I was brave enough to be seen doing it. We ran into each other, I said. Elaine leaned closer, lowering her voice as if she were protecting me. She's a good woman. Been through a lot. Just folks talk, you know. Folks talk. In a small Pennsylvania town, that sentence is less a warning than a law of nature. I nodded and pretended it didn't matter. Inside, something tightened. I could already picture the story getting passed around the diner, trimmed and sharpened until it didn't look like my life anymore. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. A text from my ex-wife, Carol, about a prescription copay for our grandson. Normal, practical. Then, a second message. Heard you got a new friend. No emoji. No joke. Just that. My stomach dropped. It wasn't jealousy, I feared. It was the feeling of being evaluated. Again, like my choices were still part of someone else's ledger. I'd promised Margaret coffee on Friday. It was Tuesday, and already I felt the town closing in around a simple cup of coffee. I told myself to ignore it. I told myself I was too old to care what people said. Then I caught myself straightening my shirt before a customer came to the counter, like I was preparing for judgment. Friday came with a clean, pale winter sun. I sat in my truck outside the diner where we'd agreed to meet. The place had the same faded sign it's had for 20 years. Through the window, I could see the booths, the coffee mugs, the familiar backs of familiar heads. This was my territory, my safe ground. And somehow that made it harder. My hands stayed on the steering wheel. I watched a couple walk in, laughing, shoulders close. I watched a teenage girl carry 2 milkshakes, like she was balancing hope itself. I could pull out, drive home, and tell myself it was for the best. I could text Margaret something polite, work ran late, a headache, a family thing, and retreat to the quiet life I understood. That was the choice. Protect my reputation or risk it. Protect my dignity or risk looking foolish. Not because of love. Because of the simple act of being seen, wanting company. I thought about Margaret's face when she'd said coffee. No excitement. No games. Just a guarded yes. If I disappeared now, she wouldn't chase me. She'd just file it away as proof that people mean less than they say. I realized that scared me more than gossip did. So I got out of the truck. The bell over the diner door rang when I stepped in. Warm air and the smell of bacon hit me. I saw Margaret at a corner table, hands around a mug like she was warming them. She looked up. Her expression didn't soften into relief. It stayed careful, like she'd been ready for either outcome. "You came," she said. "I said I would," I answered, and heard the stubbornness in my own voice. We ordered coffee. We talked about small things at first, weather, potholes, how the town never fixes a street until someone breaks an axle. Then my phone buzzed again. Carol. I didn't open it, but I felt the screen like a weight in my pocket. Margaret noticed. "You don't have to be here if it complicates your life," she said quietly. That sentence landed harder than any rumor. Because she wasn't accusing me. She was offering me an exit. I looked at her and saw something I hadn't wanted to see. She expected people to leave. Not dramatically. Just habitually. Like rain. I could take the exit. I could say, "You're right," and keep my life simple. Or I could do the adult thing I've avoided for years. Tell the truth without making it a performance. "It's not you," I said. "It's me being too concerned with what everyone thinks." She held my gaze. "They'll talk either way," she said. "The question is what you do while they're talking." I didn't have a clever answer. I just nodded. And for the first time since my divorce, I felt my dignity shift from something I defended to something I earned. When we walked out 10 minutes later, Patty and Elaine were in the parking lot by their car. Of course they were. Patty waved. Elaine smiled. Margaret looked at them, then at me. "Do you want to pretend we didn't sit together?" she asked, her voice neutral, almost kind. My throat tightened again, the same stone. Because now the choice wasn't theoretical. It was right there, under the open sky. I took a breath. "No," I said. "I'm done pretending." Margaret's eyes flickered, just once. Not joy. Not romance. Something closer to surprise, and a faint, cautious respect. Then she nodded and walked to her car alone, leaving me standing with the truth I'd chosen. And as I watched her drive away, my phone buzzed a final time. A voicemail notification. I didn't need to listen to know what it would contain. The town, the past, and the pressure to go back to quiet. The only thing I wasn't sure of was whether I had the nerve to stay where I'd just stepped. I sat in the truck for a while, before turning the key. The old habit in me wanted to make a speech out of it, to prove something to myself. But this wasn't a movie. It was a man deciding, late in life, that he'd rather be honest than comfortable. On the drive home, I passed the little white church where my mother used to insist we sit in the same pew. I could almost hear the whispers that would circle there on Sunday. For a moment, my courage thinned. Then I remembered Margaret's face, how she'd asked for nothing and still got offered doubt. That thought stayed with me all day. The chair across from me stayed empty for 3 days, and I caught myself glancing at it like an idiot. Not in the diner, at home. I'd set it out at the kitchen table without thinking, the way you do when you're used to having someone sit there, even if you haven't had that in years. The worst part was how ordinary the emptiness looked. No drama. No slammed doors. Just quiet where a voice might have been. Margaret didn't text after our coffee. I told myself that was fine. We were grown adults, not teenagers keeping score. Still, I checked my phone too often, then scolded myself for it. In a small town, people don't only talk, they watch for patterns. If Margaret and I kept meeting, the pattern would become a story. If we didn't, the story would still exist, only with a different ending. I figured she decided the simplest ending was best. On the 4th day, I saw her car at the library parking lot as I drove past. Instinct pulled at me to turn in. Pride pulled harder to keep going. I kept driving, then hated myself for it before I even reached the next stop sign. That's the kind of distance you can create in a single block. That night, I found myself organizing nails by size in my garage, a job that didn't need doing. It didn't work. My mind kept returning to her face outside the diner, to the way she'd offered me an exit, as if exits were what men chose when things got complicated. I told myself I was done pretending, but in my own kitchen, I was doing a quieter kind of pretending. Pretending I didn't miss her presence. The next morning at the hardware store, I caught the change in people's eyes. Not hostility. Something softer. Worse, curiosity. Men I'd known for years asked if business was good, then waited a beat too long, like they were hoping I'd fill the silence with news. I realized then what I was really afraid of, not being judged, but being reduced. One more story in a town full of stories. Around closing, Patty wandered in for batteries, which in our town can mean anything from gossip to company. She glanced at me like she was reading my face. "Haven't seen you with Margaret lately," she said. "Maybe you're not supposed to," I replied, sharper than I meant. Patty lifted her hands in surrender. "Just saying, she's careful. Always has been. After Frank passed, she kept her world small. Safer that way." After she left, those words sat in my chest. Careful. That was me, too. Maybe that's why it felt like we'd understood each other without saying much. Maybe that's also why we could vanish from each other's days so easily. I drove home and sat in the driveway with the engine off, watching my porch light glow in the dark. I thought about texting Margaret something simple. "Hope you're all right." But even that felt like pressure. Then I thought about not texting at all, and that felt like cowardice. At 59, you'd think a man would know the difference. The truth is, the difference changes depending on what you're protecting. The next morning, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. No envelope, just a folded receipt from the diner with handwriting I recognized, controlled, like it didn't allow mistakes. It read, "Thomas, if you have a minute, I'll be at St. Luke's thrift drop-off at 2 m." St. Luke's was the church on the edge of town, the one with the sign that always listed the bake sale before it listed anything holy. I stared at the note longer than I should have. My first thought wasn't excitement. It was suspicion of myself. Why did one line of ink make my heart act like it had something to prove? At 1:50, I was still sitting on my couch with my coat on, keys in my hand, arguing with myself. If I went, the town would notice eventually. If I didn't go, I'd keep my life quiet, and quiet is what I'd trained myself to want. I pictured Margaret waiting by that shed, looking at her watch, then deciding she'd been right to keep her world small. That image made my stomach turn. So I stood up and left. At 2, I parked beside the donation shed. Margaret was there with a cardboard box, sleeves rolled up, hair pinned back, moving with the efficiency of someone who learned not to ask for help. She didn't smile when she saw me. She didn't apologize for the silence. She just said, "Thank you for coming." "What's going on?" I asked. She set the box down and looked at her hands. "I needed to see if you meant what you said," she replied. "About not pretending." I felt the ground shift a little. "You could have just asked." "I did," she said softly. "At the store. And you stayed silent." That hit me, because she was right. My silence had been my answer back then, an answer that said, "I won't risk myself for this." I swallowed. "I'm trying to be different," I said. Margaret nodded once, like she'd heard promises before and learned to measure only actions. Then she surprised me. "When I said people our age don't fall in love," she began, "I wasn't talking about you. I was talking about me." I didn't interrupt. "My husband got sick fast," she continued. "And before that, there were years where he was here, but not really here. I learned to be practical. I learned to run the days. Love became something you manage, not something you trust." She exhaled. "If I say it's over at our age, I don't have to feel foolish for wanting it." There it was, the hidden motive. Not a rule, a shield. I stood beside her in the cold air, listening to the wind rattle the thin metal of the donation shed. The old Thomas wanted to give her a speech, to reassure her, to fix it. The newer part of me knew better. Fixing can be another way of controlling. So I made a smaller choice. "I can't promise you anything," I said, "but I can show up. If you let me." Margaret looked up then, looked like she was deciding whether I was safe. "Showing up is the hard part," she said. "Then I'll start there," I answered. We carried boxes together in quiet. No big moment. Just two adults doing a simple task, letting the simplicity mean something. Before she left, she touched the folded receipt in my hand. "I don't want to be anyone's rumor," she said. "I want to be someone's real." I watched her drive away, and for the first time, the town's whispers felt smaller than my own conscience. Later that night, my phone rang. It was Carol. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. "Just checking in," she said, too casual. "People are saying things." "I know," I replied. "Let them." There was a pause on the line, like she didn't recognize that voice as mine. When I hung up, my house felt less quiet, not because Margaret was here, but because I'd finally stopped using silence as my hiding place. The voicemail sat on my phone like an unopened bill, small, annoying, and impossible to ignore. I listened to it in my driveway with the engine off, the world quiet except for the ticking of my cooling hood. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even dramatic. It was my sister, Donna, reminding me about Sunday dinner and adding carefully, Margaret's name came up at church. Just be smart. Be smart. At 59, people say that as if it means be invisible. I didn't call Donna back right away. Instead, I drove to the park at the edge of town, the one with a cracked basketball court and a walking loop that older couples use like a daily appointment. I sat on a bench and watched a man about my age toss breadcrumbs to geese like he was paying off a debt. Two teenage boys argued about a free throw and then laughed as if nothing in the world could last. I felt the old habit rise in me. Shrink, wait, let the noise pass. That habit has kept me safe for years. It has also kept me alone. Margaret's note from the thrift drop-off was still folded in my pocket, soft at the creases. I kept hearing her sentence from that shed, "I want to be someone's real," and it landed on me like a responsibility I hadn't earned yet. I could choose quiet again. I could keep showing up only when it was private, only when no one could label it. That would protect my reputation and, honestly, my comfort. But it would also teach her the same lesson she'd learned before. Men offer steadiness until the room gets loud. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I made a plan that wasn't about comfort. I called Margaret and asked if she'd meet me at the library after closing, in the little reading room that smells like old paper and lemon cleaner. "Just to talk," I said, and I kept my tone simple, like I was asking about the weather. "I can do that," she replied. No hesitation. Just the steady voice of a woman who's learned to face hard things head on. That evening, snow threatened but didn't commit. The parking lot lights threw pale circles onto the pavement. Margaret was already inside when I arrived, sitting at the long table with her hands folded, coat still on. She looked like someone waiting for a verdict, calm on the surface, braced underneath. I sat across from her. For a moment we just listened to the building settle, heat clicking in the vents, a distant cart rolling somewhere in the stacks. It struck me how different this was from dating when I was young. Back then, silence felt like failure. Now, it felt like respect. "I don't want to be a problem in your life," she said first. "Or a rumor." "You're not," I answered. "And I'm tired of living like my life is something to manage for other people." She studied me, like she was checking for exaggeration. "That's easy to say once," she said. "It's harder when your phone rings. When someone checks in. When you feel stupid." "I know," I said. "I've been building my days around not feeling stupid. Around not being surprised. That's what my silence was about." Margaret's eyes softened a fraction. "Why did you stay silent?" "Because I was scared," I thought. Scared of hope. Scared of losing the neat identity I'd made out of being fine. But I didn't dress it up. "Because I didn't want to want anything," I said. "Wanting makes you visible. It makes you disappointable." She let that land. Then she nodded once, slow. "That's exactly why I said what I said," she admitted. "If I declare it over, I don't have to risk being wrong." There was no romance in that sentence, just truth. And truth, I've learned, is the closest thing adults get to a love story. I took a breath and made the final choice that actually mattered. Not whether the town approved. Not whether we looked perfect. Whether I would meet her fear with honesty instead of reassurance. "I can't promise you a grand new life," I said. "I can't promise we won't have awkward days or bad timing or people who run their mouths. I can promise something smaller. She didn't move. What? That if I say I'll be somewhere, I'll be there, I said. That if you tell me you need space, I'll respect it. That if you tell me you're scared, I won't make you feel foolish for it. And I won't hide you to protect my pride. Margaret stared at her hands, and for a second I thought she might stand up and leave. Instead, she exhaled like she'd been holding air for years. I don't need a rescue, she said quietly. I need steadiness. I can do steadiness, I replied. It's the one thing I've practiced my whole life. A small smile touched her mouth, brief, almost reluctant. And what do you need? She asked. That question surprised me. Most of my life, I've been the man who offers, not the man who asks. I need to stop using silence as a shelter, I said. I need to be the kind of man who can sit across from someone and let it be real, even when it's inconvenient. Margaret looked up then, and her gaze was direct, not soft, not flirtatious, just present. All right, she said. We'll try it your way. Real. We didn't hold hands. We didn't make promises that sounded like commercials. We talked about practical things, how often we'd meet, what boundaries mattered, what we didn't want repeated from our pasts. We even laughed once, quietly, when we realized we both hated loud restaurants and both kept extra batteries in a drawer, just in case. Two adults building something carefully, like you'd build a porch step so it doesn't wobble. When we finally stood to leave, she paused by the door. Thomas, she said, if the town gets loud, don't punish me for it. I won't, I told her. I'll let them be loud. I'm done shrinking. On the way home, I finally texted Donna. I'm fine. Stop worrying. It felt small, but it was mine. For once. No apology. Outside, the air bit at our cheeks. Snow started to fall and thin, lazy flakes, catching in her hair. She turned toward her car, then stopped and looked back. At our age, she said. The same phrase as before, but different now. Maybe love is just showing up. I felt that stone in my throat again, but it wasn't pressure this time. It was warmth. Then I'll show up, I said. I drove home through quiet streets and parked under my porch light. Inside, the house was the same size it had always been. The silence was still there. But it wasn't a hiding place anymore. It was simply space. Space for a life that might finally include someone else without either of us pretending we were young.